A lot of the conversations one has with European and US stakeholders, there's a kind of a focus on coups in West Africa, and other kind of like these kind of traditional security issues. There's a kind of a development and profit blindness, I think, kind of on the US and EU side, which kind of echoes their general kind of like lack of just never seeing Africa as a commercial opportunity. And I think, that creates a huge opportunity, I think, for actual kind of like relatively lower level, kind of actual strategic infusions of cash that could have really big kind of impacts, I think, and that would then unlock Africa as a mass market for Chinese kind of entities.
My bigger question to African policymakers is, do you actually understand China's role now globally in terms of how it needs to maintain that level of momentum as an economic producer, as a manufacturer, the fact that it has actually disrupted the global value chain, whether you're talking about its automotive sector, the electric vehicle market, the question of its production that is subsidized. I mean, I think, to be clear, we feel it in South Africa when it comes to the steel subsidization that China has, which also impacts on our steel production market. And so this is something that we need to understand.
When I was in the United Arab Emirates a few years ago, our host took us to a tea processing facility. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. And where they basically take, raw tea leaves, put them into bags, and then ship them back out. And then you discover that these tea leaves came raw from Kenya, were dried and packed into tea bags, and then sold back to Kenya at 3 times the cost. And that, you just think to yourself, is ridiculous. I mean, how ridiculous that is. I mean, and how much money is lost.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, coming to us very early in the morning from Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, we are continuing our journey this month, looking at different aspects and different perspectives of the upcoming Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit that's going to take place in Beijing in the first week of September. We've had a chance in our previous episodes to talk to various scholars, and we're going to do that again today. We've got some fantastic folks lined up for you to, again, give different perspectives on this very multifaceted, complex relationship. But before we get into that, I also want to let everybody know that we've published 2 amazing reports. And I say that, I mean, yes, I'm 100% biased, but this is just incredible work that, Cobus, you have done. You looked at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation both from the Chinese perspective and the African perspective in terms of what they want to get out of it. These reports are available on our site. I'll put them in the show notes. They are pinned to the top of our X feed. So if you want to find them, they are free. They're PDFs, and they are absolutely fantastic. So I will sing your praises there because I know you're too humble to do it. But let's get started and just kind of dive in and look at it from both sides. Taking Control, Africa's Challenges and Priorities at FOCAC 24. That was the title of the Africa report that you did. Give us the headline of what you were trying to achieve in that report, and what are the priorities and the challenges facing African negotiators and leaders coming up in Beijing?
Well, I think frequently for people who aren't particularly immersed in FOCAC, there's a lot of kind of code and, opacity, I think, in the FOCAC process from the outside. So I was trying to, in the first place, to just put people in the picture in terms of where FOCAC is now in its evolution. But from the African side, I was arguing, and it'll be interesting to see whether other people agree and also whether it's borne out. But I was arguing that one of the strong focuses from the African side is industrialization. And with that comes electricity, obviously. So energy is a strong priority on both sides. But from the African side, industrialization and then particularly agricultural trade and agricultural beneficiation and training is really important. And with that, training more generally. So skills transfer is a really, really big part of the China-Africa relationship. It's been for a long time. And I think it's probably going to be enhanced at FOCAC simply because there's such demand on the African side, and it's a relatively cheap thing for the Chinese to do, and one that also centers Chinese standards, which is something that China is really interested in. From the Chinese side, I also argued that, as I said, green energy is a really key one because there's huge supply on the Chinese side and huge demand on the African side. And Chinese companies are increasingly facing a lot of sanctions in the global north. From the Chinese side, what I think they're also pushing for similar reasons is connectivity, particularly ICT connectivity. Also because Chinese companies have huge potential and huge capacity on data networks and other all up and down the tech stack, but also they're facing a lot of constraints in traditional markets. And a lot of those companies are also at the same time moving into green energy. And also on the Chinese side, the connectivity extends into political connectivity. So, for them, making space for Chinese standards, making space for Chinese ideas on how the world should work, how the internet should work, how all of these different global systems should be organized, particularly in spaces like the UN, is a really big priority, particularly as they face also, again, geopolitical pressure. So from China's side, that kind of coordination is an important job that FOCAC does.
We got some new numbers this week from the China General Administration of Customs. $167 billion of trade between China and African countries in the January to July period. That's up 5.5% compared to the same period last year. Let me just give you a little bit of breakdown of those numbers. $97 billion of Chinese exports to Africa, and then China imported $69 billion in return from African countries. About 2/3 of that trade is dominated by raw materials. And so that speaks to the point that you were talking about, beneficiation. And that's a fancy word for processing and adding value to products rather than just pulling stuff out of the ground and putting it on a boat and sending it over. Seems like that is going to be a major topic at FOCAC, is how to add value to African products. But the fundamental crux of that problem, though, and we're going to talk about this with our guest today, is how do you do that if you don't have the big ticket infrastructure that needs to be spent? Africa has more than $100 billion a year of an infrastructure deficit, particularly in the energy sector, as you noted. So the key question is, how do you add value, Cobus, if you don't have the energy to do that?
That's an important question, and it's one of the reasons why I think energy is going to be such a big topic. But I think what also comes with it is one needs to have some creative thinking about what beneficiation and value addition actually is going to mean. Because, on the one hand, hardcore, like high-tech mineral refining, that is one way of doing that, particularly in the mining and mineral space. And we've seen that Zimbabwe, for example, has put a lot of pressure on external actors to do that with lithium. In the case of Zimbabwe now, so far it mostly means separating the lithium from mud, essentially, which is the first level of basic refining. And, kind of moving up that chain towards battery-grade lithium is going to take a lot more, and a lot of even Chinese actors have been saying it's going to be a big, a long shot in the Zimbabwean industrial landscape with, that lacks, for example, an ecosystem of industrial chemicals to do that. But beneficiation can also mean, for example, a lot of African agricultural products are exported at the most basic level. So, for example, I recently saw data that was showing that cashew nuts, which is a big crop in places like Mozambique, a lot of them are exported, cashews grow in they're surrounded by a kind of a fruit, right? A kind of a pod. So the first work of beneficiation of a cashew crop is just to take the nuts out of the pods. But frequently they are simply picked and shipped. And actually a country like India, which doesn't actually grow that much cashews, end up being like, processed cashews, quote unquote processed cashews, which is simply removing them from those pods, is a big export for them. So simply, you don't need high technology to do that. You may need some electricity, but if you could deshell them and then roast them, that's 2 levels of value addition already added to a very basic crop, and you essentially then sell them for twice the amount. So there's different ways of doing it. Kind of like it doesn't all have to be like mega industrialization, huge energy output, etc.
And you can see the benefit to local economies if this is actually done. And I mentioned this example previously on the show, but when I was in the United Arab Emirates a few years ago, our host took us to a tea processing facility. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. And where they basically take, raw tea leaves, put them into bags, and then ship them back out. And then you discover that these tea leaves came raw from Kenya, were dried and packed into tea bags, and then sold back to Kenya at 3 times the cost. And that, you just think to yourself, is ridiculous. I mean, how ridiculous that is. I mean, and how much money is lost.
Exactly. It's ridiculous. And Africa is increasingly trying to capture that value. So a lot of the discussion is around things like turning fresh tomatoes into tomato paste, for example, or tomato concentrate. Like, it's that level of like relatively basic things, but if you can do it, then it's a huge payoff, or particularly huge in the African context. And that also then centers Africa increasingly as a processing and export power around these basic crops, which is something that could be also useful to countries like China.
And it's an area where the Chinese have incredible experience because they themselves continue to do it today. And that's how they also came to where they are today, is through that type of processing and manufacturing. So there is some compatibility there. Well, let's get a perspective now and deep dive into this from our guests. And I say guests plural because we've got one joined us on the line, but we also have 2 others that are contributing wonderful insights into this. So we have some great discussion ahead for you today. But let's start with our discussion with Sanusha Naidu. And if you're a longtime listener of the show, you know that Sanusha has been an old friend of ours, and she's well known in the China-Africa space. Sanusha is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue and one of the leading foreign policy analysts in South Africa, looking at not only South Africa's relationship with China, but also Africa's relationship with emerging powers. Cobus, you remember we talked to Sanusha more than a decade ago when she was looking at emerging powers. So this is not something that is new to her, and we had a fascinating conversation with her earlier this week. Let's take a listen to our discussion with Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha Naidu, welcome back to the show. It's wonderful to have you. And I was just reflecting as I was preparing for the interview today, how many times you've been on our show and how long we go back. We started this thing back in 2010, and you were one of our first guests. So we now have almost 15 years of talking about China, Africa, and FOCAC. So that is a pretty long history that we have together. So great to finally speak with you on this year's FOCAC after we've spoken on this subject so many times before.
It's always a pleasure to be on the show, Eric and Cobus. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it makes me feel a bit old, given that we've been together on many different journeys and engagements. And I reference the program all the time when I'm doing some teaching, but also in my training and capacity building programs with government, particular with this new government, the Government of National Unity. And we've been just chatting recently about what needs to be on the immediate horizon for South Africa as it moves into the Government of National Unity kind of focus. And one of the things that came up was just spotlighting FOCAC. And it also made me realize to a large extent how the whole China-Africa space has evolved. And more importantly, how South Africa's relationship with China has also evolved and where we are currently. I mean, since we've been speaking from 2010, there's so many major developments that have happened in the scholarship, in the academia. There's so many more new, nuanced views, important new voices in the scholarship on the debates. And it's wonderful to see the evolution of these discussions, but also in the policy space, because I think to a large extent, the question we keep coming back to, Eric, and we constantly have this discussion about what is African agency in this whole engagement? What is African policy engagement, particularly from bilateral relations and the regional space? So I think it's exciting times, both in South Africa and for the continent, but also one that requires us to be much more pragmatic now about where this engagement is going under FOCAC. So yeah, it's wonderful to be back on the show and always learning from Eric and Cobus. So fantastic stuff.
Well, we learn far more than we share. And let's pick up our discussion right where you dropped us off in terms of these conversations that you're having with the new government of national unity in South Africa, and then kind of pull the focus back more broadly to Africa as a whole as it prepares for FOCAC. What are the people you're talking to thinking when it comes to FOCAC this year?
Well, I think it's very important for us to contextualize within the South African context that the one big issue that is now being kind of spotlighted is the question of the priorities under this new government of national unity with regard to their foreign policy orientation engagement. We have a very interesting political spectrum right now in South Africa where the body politic of the state has shifted in very real ways in terms of we no longer have a single majority party that is in power. It depends if you're speaking to the ANC, it's a government of national unity. If you're speaking to the leader of the Democratic Alliance, and in particular Helen Zille, it's a coalition government because it's the government of the two major political parties that had essentially won around about 60% collectively of the vote in the 2024 national election. But I think what's important is that the foreign policy space is integral to the domestic environment, particularly in terms of the policy engagements, the investment, the operationalization of implementation around economic growth trajectories, addressing the unemployment challenges, bringing in the kind of operation economic reforms in infrastructure, electricity. So it's all kind of very interesting, but we cannot separate that. And I think in the context of FOCAC, what I'm hearing in particular is with this new government, you've also got to bring in now a kind of understanding that South Africa's role, whether it's in FOCAC, whether it's in the BRICS, whether it's in the Global South or it's multilateralism, if you listen to the new minister talk about keeping that continuity within the foreign policy space of multilateral reform, South-South cooperation, and so forth. Within that context, I think we need more and more understanding of the nuances of the global international system, but more importantly around issues like FOCAC. And what are the synergies that you want to create, both in terms of what is it that you want from FOCAC as a country, and what is it that you want from FOCAC as a region, and more importantly, as a continent. And one of the key drivers of the continent today is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So we're hearing a lot of those dynamics, but I think understanding how these different fora play a pivotal role in synergizing efforts around what is the continental needs, whether it's around infrastructure investment, around renewable energies, around green technology, around technological innovation and change, but also in terms of critical minerals. And I think this is where we are beginning to see, or rather I'm beginning to see in South Africa, that with the new government, I think we have to also start to create that nuance of understanding of what FOCAC is. I'm not hearing much, and I could be wrong because I'm not completely plugged into the system of what government's strategy is going to be around FOCAC. But the work that I do with Parliament is really important because on the Parliament side, they want to understand how South Africa is engaging, what is the strategy, what are the key issues, the key pivots that South Africa is going to take to FOCAC in September. And I think that is an interesting space for us to start looking at this kind of understanding of strategy around FOCAC in the South African context. It doesn't mean that we're going to shift away from previous engagements, but I think just kind of up the ante a little bit because the Chinese ambassador that has been appointed to South Africa is quite a high-level person. And that in itself tells us how important the relationship is. Even before this happened, the ANC party was also very involved in trying to ensure that any kind of political change in South Africa does not necessarily undermine the relationship with South Africa's key partners, both in the Global South and the Global North. And we've been kind of, seized with the whole question of the US-South Africa relations, the question of our renewable eligibility into AGOA, dealing with the kind of irritation that is in Washington right now about South Africa and where South Africa's foreign policy is, and is it aligning and pivoting to some of the expectations within Washington. But I think on the FOCAC side, we're not seeing, with China, we're not seeing that kind of level of engagement. There's still that kind of state-to-state, G-to-G, government-to-government engagement. There's still the level of stability. And I think this is an ideal opportunity for us in South Africa to maybe as a recommendation to government to say, well, maybe you need to start developing what is your FOCAC strategy going forward. And we're not getting that sense. We're hearing about the fact that we're going to take over the presidency chairing of the G20 in 2025. The Department of International Relations and Cooperation are preparing for that, the Summit of the Future. But I'm not seeing that kind of energy being given to what is going to be our strategy, both from a SADC and a continental level towards FOCAC. And I think that's the missing middle right now for us.
So in the South African context, you mentioned this still, I mean, to me, kind of surprising lack of strategy for FOCAC compared to something like the G20. Are you seeing that same lack of strategy at the continental level? Is this a situation where African countries just don't have a China plan yet? And if so, how? Considering how long China has been a major player in Africa, like what do you think some of the factors are that underlies that?
Well, I think if I think about South Africa, I mean, we've always seen China as such a strategic partnership. We have this comprehensive strategic engagement, which is at the highest level of a binational commission. And over time, I haven't really seen a focused strategy on what is our China engagement. Yes, we have all of the policy documents, but I think it needs to be broken down into a kind of clear, coherent roadmap. These are the key critical areas. This is how we see things going. On the economic front, we see these are critical sectors that we're going to engage with China. Now, China has really come to the fore in South Africa with the fact that in the Eastern Cape, in the Kruger Development Industrial Development Zone rather, it's kind of now doing a full kind of production of one of its major automotive brands. I think it's Haval, if I'm not mistaken. But at the same time, South Africa, in terms of its economic engagement with China, I mean, it needs to open up the space and say that these are the strategic areas and this is where we need to go. So I think that is why, if you take this context of what's happening in South Africa in terms of identifying, and I cannot speak for all countries in the continent, but I think you need to have a strategy around what are your ring-fenced projects that will be critical for engaging with China over and within the FOCAC and the Belt and Road Initiative. And those ring-fence projects are going to be your infrastructure projects that are going to have important snowballing effects and regional economic spillover effects in terms of your infrastructure. And I think if you start to align it to what are your key infrastructure projects, what are your key development projects, then you can develop a strategy. And then for the other part of FOCAC, countries can still continue to engage with China on what they see as their regional focus as well. So that, I think, is what's missing right now, of Cobus.
I'm so glad that the both of you have brought up this question of strategy, because that's something that has come up in the survey of Africa-China scholars that we've done as well. So prior to this show, we reached out to a number of different scholars and asked them to say, what are you looking for at this year's FOCAC? And this strategy question came up a number of times. In fact, Cobus, it came up in our previous discussion that we had last week on this issue when we talked to some other scholars as well. Let's take a listen now. I've got two that I want to share with you. This one that I'm going to share with you now is from Paul Nantulia, who's a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington. He's one of the most well-known, highly respected Africa-China scholars. Like all of us, has been in this space for a very long time. Now, he gave us a very detailed 5-point recommendation for what he thinks should happen in Africa-China relations at FOCAC. So it's a little bit long of a summary, so bear with us, but it is absolutely fascinating, the points that he makes. And Sanusha, I'd like to get your response on the strategy question that he brings up. So let's take a listen to Paul Nantulia from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies.
I think the upcoming FOCAC 9, is a watershed. It's a milestone in China-Africa relations. It's the first FOCAC that is taking place after the initial COVID-19 outbreak. We saw some changes after COVID-19. A lot of the back and forth movement, what I call a conveyor belt between China and Africa, basically froze during COVID. At the last FOCAC, we also saw a dip in infrastructure financing. We saw a general dip in the finance package that China unveils at every FOCAC. And we also saw a strategic shift from state-led to private sector engagement and financing for trade and that sort of thing. What I expect out of the upcoming FOCAC, and what I would put down by way of recommendation is basically four things. The first is more organization, ownership, and strategic thinking on the African side. China so far has released 3 or 4 Africa strategy papers. I have not seen a single China strategy paper on the Africa side, whether it's an individual country strategy or a continental strategy or even a regional strategy. So for instance, SADC, African Union, SADC, East African Community and so on. There's really no corresponding strategy on the Africa side. One gets a sense that African countries are basically always in ad hoc mode, willing to push and obtain benefit where they can, but for the most part ceding strategic initiative and leadership to the Chinese side. So what I would like to see in the run-up to the next FOCAC, I think we've seen a bit of that. Kenya, for instance, has had a number of planning meetings. They've been planning meetings with the team of the African Diplomatic Corps in Beijing. But I think we need to see more of that. And I think this is an area where African countries could learn from CELAC, the Caribbean and Latin America Forum. Because if you look at what they do, so they have principals meeting, they have a senior officials meeting that brings the Caribbean and Latin American countries together before they meet with China. So it's the same structures within the China CELAC, but specifically for the member states. That affords them an opportunity to coordinate ahead of meetings with China. I think this is something the African side can learn, and it will be very useful. The second thing that I would like to see is a greater emphasis by the African side, not in terms of aid per se, but really in terms of securing preferential market access to the Chinese market, similar to what they have with AGOA on the American side. I think some countries like Kenya, Mauritius have tried to do that, but so far it has not been a collective effort. I think the African side needs to be more insistent in terms of coordinating a continental approach towards securing strategic market access to different parts of the Chinese economy, because I think we need to break down the Chinese economy in terms of the national economy, but then also the provincial economy, the economy at the municipal level, and the niche market that can be secured, even just from places like Shanghai, from places like Guangdong, and so on. I think countries like Rwanda have been able to show that even Kenya, that strategic market access doesn't mean access to the entire Chinese market, which is huge. Just for instance, Beijing alone is a strategic market in and of itself. So I think greater emphasis on that element. Number 3, I would like to see better emphasis on trade versus aid. And I think this is a mantra that African countries have been singing for a very long time, but in terms of the policy coherence and the structural changes that need to be made for African countries to move from trade to aid, I think much more is required on that particular space. Number 4, Eric, for me, is how to use Chinese capacity and Chinese capability to transform African economies from economies that export raw materials and import finished goods to economies that import finished goods. This value addition, strategic value addition. Again, this is a mantra that African countries have been talking about for a very long time, but I think much more needs to be done practically. And to see, obviously, China cannot develop the African continent, but China can be a catalyst. So I'd like to see more in the way of African countries working in such a way that that they use China to become a catalyst to transform these economies into value addition economies.
So a lot to think about there. And first of all, thank you, Paul, who joined us on the line from Zambia. And you could hear he was at some kind of big event in the background there, but we do appreciate him taking the time out of what he was doing there. So, Cobus, I want to get your take, but Sanusha, there was a lot for us to digest there in Paul's points that he made. Number one, this question of this ad hoc approach. And he also brings up this point that you and I have spoken about at length over the years about the benefits that Africans could have from looking at other regions around the world. Now, he pointed out how Latin America, Caribbean could be a model. We've talked about what Southeast Asia could do, but there's this need to maybe benefit from the expertise of other regions. And so let's start with you and your reaction to Paul's comments and what he said.
I think Paul has really captured, the heart of what we've been discussing with regard to FOCAC, but more importantly, where FOCAC is now. And I like the point he makes that this is a milestone summit, particularly where we are in the context of the pre- and post-COVID period. I cannot agree more with him in terms of what is the strategy? What is the organizational fit that you want now going forward? You can't keep looking at FOCAC from an African side and looking at it where, for example, you just are happy with a very small portion of what is coming to you from the Chinese side. I think the shifts in the Chinese economy, the shifts in the political and economic architecture of China, understanding the political dynamics of the Chinese Communist Party, the leadership issues, etc., where the Chinese state is moving is fundamental and critical to Africa to understand. You can't keep having this kind of, well, China's going to come and invest in our critical minerals. What does that mean? Because I think it's all interlinked. It's all kind of about how do you develop a strategy that enables you to say to not just China, but to say to all actors who have an interest in your critical minerals sector, to say we want to be able to produce these resources not just as primary exporters or raw materials, but rather to produce finished goods at source. Now, the other conversation that we probably also need to have is it's not just China that's interested in Africa's critical minerals. Everybody is doing a kind of retake on Africa's critical minerals. We see India is also interested in Africa's critical minerals as well. So it shouldn't just be a strategy that is only geared towards China. It can be adapted. It can be what you call shaped towards how you bring China in with the capabilities and capacities to understand what is the industrialization strategy of the continent, but to do it in a manner that also enables countries not to feel as if their sovereignty and independence is being overshadowed by the regional blocs or by the AU. And that, I think, is where we are really missing that context. So I think what Paul is raising is a fundamental set of recommendations that are all interlinked. And I think also what we haven't been able to do is identify those strategic areas within the Chinese market that are going to be critical for us, whether we want to call it a preferential trade agreement or some kind of a preferential market access. But at the end of the day, I get the sense that we're still sitting very much in the 100 meters of the 200-meter sprint.
But Cobus, I want to get your reaction to Paul and to also what Sanusha said. But if I could express a little frustration, Sanusha, with what you said about critical minerals, because this is a topic we keep hearing over and over and over again about how African countries want to move up the value supply chain in critical minerals. That simply is not possible in the current environment and not in the foreseeable future because of infrastructure. Critical minerals require huge amounts of electricity and vast quantities of water. That's problem number one and number two. And problem number three, and we talked to some South African experts on this about why isn't South Africa processing and refining minerals before it exports to China? It's better positioned to do this than any other country in the world, or certainly in Africa, given the fact that it has the resources at source. It's got an infrastructure that on a good day can handle it. But yet, here's the quiet part that people don't want to talk about. And this is what, as South African experts were talking with, telling us that they can't compete with Chinese subsidies. The fact is that Chinese companies that process minerals get subsidies on water, on electricity, on land, on any number of things, making it so that the China price is vastly cheaper than it'll ever be in South Africa. And why aren't we talking about that more? It's never going to happen that you're going to be able to produce refined minerals at a cheaper price than what China does because you can't match the subsidies.
I think you're completely right. You've actually opened up a very important point which tends to fly over the heads of certain people when they talk about China. They assume that China has come to its economic growth. It's come to this point in where it is as a major global economic and political actor just because there was some kind of magic wand that happened. Nobody understands. Some of the policymakers that I speak to in South Africa, even some of the legislators that I speak to, tend to have a very romanticized view of China and don't understand that China's role and growth has actually been about how it has dealt with that internally. But having done that, my bigger question to African policymakers is, do you actually understand China's role now globally in terms of how it needs to maintain that level of momentum as an economic producer, as a manufacturer, the fact that it has actually disrupted the global value chain, whether you're talking about its automotive sector, the electric vehicle market, the question of its production that is subsidized. I mean, I think, to be clear, we feel it in South Africa when it comes to the steel subsidization that China has, which also impacts on our steel production market. And so this is something that we need to understand. And I think to take Paul's point further about this kind of strategic market in China and where that strategic market is it within particular cities? Is it within particular industries and sectors, etc., is to also understand what does it mean when we talk about access to the Chinese market, one, but also what does it mean when we say we can have value-added production at source when it comes to critical minerals. I think the big challenge for Africa, in particular under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, for me personally, is to develop some kind of industrialization strategy that says these are the areas that are now we are going to develop. And to be able to say that on that area, the big challenge is infrastructure. Infrastructure, logistics and transport corridors are all in a mess in certain parts of the continent. You can't get to the ports. Some of the ports are still weak in terms of their capacity to absorb traffic. And of course, you're trying to build up those ports. And those ports are not being built by African countries. Some of them are being built by external actors who then have particular interests as to why they want to have those ports either rehabilitated or upgraded or being developed as transport corridors, whether it's on the east coast of Africa and so forth. And I think the point that we need to understand is that there's not enough kind of, in the case of African countries as well, you have different economies of scale, so all are not going to have the same expectations of FOCAC. But at the same time, I think this is where the role of the AU becomes critical and the role of regional economic blocs. If you can create the kind of importance of priority of projects, for example, SADC, the Southern African Development Corporation, has a industrialization strategy. I'm not sure whether that industrialization strategy has been upgraded. I hear a lot of policy talk, but I'm not seeing the policy implementation. And so you got this competition in SADC between South Africa and Botswana has now issued a kind of challenge to South Africa over its some agricultural products in terms of tariff protection. But that doesn't help us because at the end of the day, we're supposed to have a regional market. And this is where I think you need to start thinking about the fact that if you want to develop these critical minerals, you want to develop critical sectors, you want to access the Chinese market, you have to understand what is your role in terms of enabling the market to do so, but understand that China is also a major actor that's going to protect its national security, economic interests. And the WTO, for me, is also another critical area of the global arena where I think we have to understand that the interests of actors in the WTO, again, and as well as in the global economy, is not always the interest of others. It's their own interest.
Cobus, let's get you to reflect on all of this.
I fully agree with Paul also. The fantasy that China is going to industrialize Africa, everyone should let go of that fantasy. I do think, however, is that it feels to me that there isn't enough energy being put into the African thinking about the future potential of unified African market. And of course, this is happening against the background of the free trade area. So at the very high level, there's all of these moves towards integration. But the one lesson I think one can really take from China, and I think that's where China can play this kind of China isn't, as Paul said, China isn't going to industrialize Africa, but China can act as a kind of a catalyst for African-led industrialization. And one, I think, lesson one can take from China is from something like the Hisense factory in Cape Town, which is producing it produces white goods like, kind of microwaves and other kind of domestic appliances. And it's not producing them for export, it's producing them for the continental market. And, it's producing in Cape Town and then it goes to South Africa and then it goes across the borders and into the Southern African region. And it seems to me that the kind of strategic opportunities offered by the African market needs to really come first in terms of the thinking, because that once one has kind of isolated and identified the specific opportunities offered by the market, then one can start kind of moving towards, taking a leaf from China's book again, and kind of as they did with the which became very controversial later, but the Made in China 2025 strategy a few years ago, where they kind of isolated and identified certain kind of key strategic commercial areas like electric vehicles, for example, to kind of pour a lot of energy into. In a similar way, Africans, I think, for example, small scale, very cheap electric vehicles in Africa, kind of like on the level of electric bikes and scooters and that kind of thing, that is very much a strategic niche in Africa. And if someone can manufacture those at scale, they can make a lot of money, because Africans will be able to afford them at, if you price them correctly, and they can then, it can be transformative across the subcontinent. So there are very much opportunities there. And it seems to me that once one has isolated those opportunities on a regional level, one could then work with Chinese producers and importers to set up something kind of like production at in some kind of African country and export across the borders using the free trade area. But I do think people need to be. Okay, this doesn't sound good, but I think in some ways Africans need to be humble is the wrong word, but pragmatic and realistic. I think in terms of what the real value of these kind of lower end kind of niches are, because they haven't really been explored that much, and at the same time temper some of their large scale kind of fantasies of how, say, lithium is going to make them rich. Because as Eric we were pointing out, it's probably there's a lot of structural barriers to that particular path to success. Whereas I think really exploiting the African market is something only really Africans can do, I think.
Yes. And I think having a more sober conversation about the role that critical minerals and where Africa is and what keeps African countries down is important to have, just not disconnected from reality, as I think so much of it has been up until this point. Okay, let's continue our survey of scholars and analysts to get their forecast as to what's going to happen at FOCAC. And we're thrilled to have back on our show again Yunnan Chen. Longtime listeners of the program will recognize her. She's a research fellow at ODI's Development and Public Finance program. And like Paul and Sanusha and Kobus and all of us, she's been in this space for a very long time. She has 3 points that everybody should focus on at FOCAC 9.
There are 3 things that I would be looking out for the FOCAC summit. The first is really the kind of thematic focus. With every FOCAC that has happened over the last 20 years, there's been a sort of Uber narrative, and you see that shift over time as a sort of weather vane of where the China-Africa relationship is heading. In some years it's been on industrial cooperation and industrialization and structural transformation, then shifting to infrastructure in the early 2010s, security, and then most recently, obviously in the COVID pandemic, health cooperation was the big focus of the last one. And I really expect with the coming FOCAC, given the direction that China's overseas engagement is going, the shift to the green BRI, that we will see green finance and green cooperation in renewable energy, in green transport, to be a significant feature for China-Africa cooperation. The other thing to look for is, of course, where does this actually land? What are the concrete pledges to come out of it? In previous years, you have these kind of big ticket figures. In 2015 and 2018, there was a huge announcement of the 60 billion package of financing from China to African actors and financial institutions. And it's important to pay attention to where that is going as well. I think we are seeing indications of a greater appetite for risk mitigation and financial collaboration. And I think what was interesting in the recent FOCAC was greater financing pledged to African regional banks, regional development banks. And so I think it will be interesting to see how that expands and how Chinese financial institutions may be looking for more opportunities to work with both international, national and regional financiers in Africa. And finally, FOCAC is also a huge opportunity for bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. It's an opportunity for handshaking, red carpets, and for African sovereigns to, if they can, bring their agenda directly to Xi Jinping in a face-to-face meeting. And we've seen in previous FOCACs that these have been quite good opportunities as well for extracting certain kinds of concessions, particularly around debt restructuring. So I would be curious to see whether or not the next FOCAC becomes a photo op, an opportunity for China to announce a show of its contribution to debt relief for certain African sovereigns, potentially those involved in the common framework, and whether or not we'll see some key milestones of progress when it comes to some of these debt restructuring negotiations, particularly with the common framework countries.
Thank you, Yunnan. There's a lot, again, for us to think about. Sunusha Kobus, she talked about the big number. Are we going to see a big number coming out of this FOCAC? Remember, in the past, there's been 20 billion, then 60 billion, and then last time it was some fuzzy number of around 40 billion. But as we've talked about previously, very difficult to track whether or not the Chinese actually follow through with these pledges. We don't know if the $10 billion of special drawing rights that were pledged at the last FOCAC were actually delivered to Africa, because the IMF's way of calculating that is incredibly complex. We talked to some folks in Washington who said that would be very difficult to actually determine. Secondly, $1 billion in vaccines never materialized. The huge promises of buying Chinese goods or African imports never materialized in the volumes that they promised. $10 billion of export credits they promised. We don't know, in fact, if that actually happened or not. So a lot of questions about whether or not it even matters anymore, Sunusha, if they have a big number. What's your response to what Yunnan was saying in this question of, should we expect a big number as the headline at the end of FOCAC?
I actually think we should temper our expectations around these numbers because, as you rightly point out, and that has been one of my pet peeves about FOCAC, is what is the monitoring and evaluation of these pledges? Who's monitoring them? Who's evaluating them? Who's actually providing a kind of report card from previous FOCAC in the intervening period from, say, 2021 to 2024, what has been delivered. So I think that if we are banking on the numbers, then we should actually be much more pragmatic and realize that the numbers can actually be very misleading and misinterpret what is being pledged. And I think here is where I would like to see more African energy put into the evaluation of what's being pledged, because that will play a critical role in what kind of engagement you're going to have. And it circles back to the point that Paul made, and that is this kind of ad hoc mode approach that is being defined from the African side in terms of organizational engagement and having more ownership of the process. Even if it's, if you see FOCAC like the way the Americans see AGOA as a sovereign framework that they are delivering to a kind of preferential market access for countries that are eligible, I think it doesn't really make any difference if you make the same argument in terms of, well, the Chinese can say, well, we actually also claim ownership of this. It's our FOCAC or whatever. There's another discrepancy around that. But I think Africa can take ownership of it in a way that actually creates the monetary balance. So I would be very wary to even expect a number. And even if there is a number that's attached to FOCAC 9, I would be even more skeptical to say that that number is a real number.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think one also should also keep in mind what role the number played for China in the kind of mid-2010s. That was a moment of peak BRI triumphalism. It was a moment when China had a lot of symbolism riding on it having achieved a certain kind of level of superpower status, like financial superpower status. So it was part of the kind of big rollout, the kind of the kind of flair and and dramatism of the big BRI rollout was also the announcement of these big plans. So it had a kind of a daddy warbucks kind of aspect to it. Who has money? China has money. Obviously, shifted in China a lot. The Chinese economy is facing some structural challenges. That was kind of packed into its development process, and it's now having to reckon with them. And it doesn't work politically to make this kind of big swaggering announcement now, because the politics of the world has shifted. In a lot of ways, if China makes a big kind of splashy number announcement at FOCAC this year, it'll just kind of paint a target on that from the G7 side, is my instinct. So I fully expect fuzziness. I think it's going to be a lot of announcements, a lot of vague announcements, I think, but probably probably not any kind of like any number that anyone can then kind of be put on the hook for, I think. And we've also seen that from other Africa Plus One, kind of actors as well. Japan has been fudging the numbers a lot, kind of in the last TICA too.
Yeah, and the US did with its $55 billion that was mostly recycled, and Global Gateway as well. But let me put something to both of you that I was thinking about. So Cobus, over the past several weeks, we've had a number of conversations both in Washington and with European stakeholders who say that the US and Europe have taken their eye off of Africa. I mean, they don't care anymore. I mean, it's really hard to get Africa on the agenda. It's hard to get them to pay attention to it. This feels like we're back in the early 2000s when that was also the case and when China really moved in. So imagine what Yunnan was saying about maybe not a big number bilaterally or a big number of this fuzzy number, but actually injecting the AFDB with real amounts of money for infrastructure from the Chinese. Okay. And whereas all the fuzziness that's coming from the US and Europe with their programs, the Chinese can take advantage of the moment that we're in right now for relatively cheap to have a very big lasting impact that could lock in influence for the next 10 years. What do you think of that idea? If they see the moment as we are right now with those guys looking away because of wars in Europe and the Mideast, that this is the moment for China once again to recapture its ability to influence Africa. What do you think?
I think there's definitely something there. I think what comes with it is, what has been reiterated, I think, over the last year or so is that the US and Europe tend to kind of fall back in these kind of very kind of geostrategic kind of moments in the Middle East, with Russia, in the South China Sea, where their answer to everything is military. And that is to a certain extent being echoed in Africa too. Like in a lot of the conversations one has with European and US stakeholders, there's a kind of a focus on coups in West Africa and, and other kind of like these kind of traditional security issues. There's a kind of a development and profit blindness, I think, kind of on the US and EU side, which kind of echoes their general kind of like lack of just never seeing Africa as a commercial opportunity. And I think, that creates a huge opportunity, I think, for actual kind of like relatively lower level, kind of actual strategic infusions of cash that could have really big kind of impacts, I think, and that would then unlock Africa as a mass market for Chinese kind of entities. So, Nusha, what do you think?
I can see it happening. I think it makes for an ideal opportunity to reassert yourself. And I like the point that Eric made about this injection of capital into African financial institutions, whether it's the African Development Bank or other kind of institutions. My sense is that where China was in the 2000s and where China is today is probably something we need to give consideration to, because if there is going to be that capital injection to re-pivot into Africa or reclaim for the next 10 years a sense of influence and engagement and lock things down, the question would be, would it be the Chinese state that's bringing in that capital, or would it be the kind of point that Yunnan made about financial cooperation, both with African institutions, but financial cooperation also between the Chinese financial stakeholders, so the private sector coming in. And I think it ties in very nicely with the idea of how the shift has also happened with regard to the way the Chinese have looked at their financing structure, their engagement in Africa, bringing in more of the private sector from China and perhaps even working with other private sector entities to invest in Africa. And that will be key, because then it will be about the risk mitigation that she mentioned. And it will also be about the question of whether we'll see any kind of debt restructuring. And for me, what's really interesting in terms of where traditional IFIs are in Africa, in particular around what we're seeing in terms of the conversations that you all had with stakeholders in Washington and elsewhere, but also in terms of what we're seeing as the IMF coming back into Africa. If we just look at Kenya and we look at that kind of impact of the kind of engagement and how that kind of came back to haunt the Ruto government in terms of the hike in the tax bill, the question of the loan, etc., and the pivots around Kenya-US relations, etc. I think it also may be something that China will be looking at in a very real way. So if there is to be that kind of financial kind of reconfiguration or re-establishment or energizing China in Africa and capturing the space once again, I think the question for me would be, who are these actors that are going to come in and inject capital into Africa? And more importantly, I think we cannot ignore that China's competitor is not only the West, only the US or Europe. We have to look at the Gulf states and how much of a traction they are developing in Africa, also with regard to their financial engagements and the fact that they are becoming quite key actors in a strategic way in Africa.
Well, that's a lot for us to think about. Sanusha, thank you so much for your insights and your time today. We also want to thank Yunnan Chen and Paul Nantulia for their contributions as well. By the way, everybody, if you'd like to read columns by both Paul, Yunnan, they're on our Twitter page, and I also included Cobus's amazing FOCAC analysis on and pinned right to the top of our Twitter page. We're going to, or X, I think, we're going to keep it there for the next few weeks, actually, and we're just going to keep adding new columns as they come in from different experts. And again, the exercise that we're trying to do here is to bring voices like Sanusha's, Paul's. We had Ovigwe Egu from Development Reimagined last week, and all these different voices to help you better understand what's going to happen or what should happen at FOCAC 9 and where we are in the China-Africa relationship. So Sanusha, thank you so much for your time today. It was wonderful to have the chance to speak with you. Here we are, 15 years later, still doing this, still having a very lively, dynamic conversation. Who would have thought back in 2010 that we would still be doing this all these years later? But it has never gotten boring talking about these issues with you, so we really appreciate your time today.
Absolutely, and thank you. And maybe in the next 15 years, we'll have some kind of solution to some of these debates we are having.
Yeah, I think we should go back through the recordings. So in 2035 or 2040, when we get back together again, we should see, how effective all of these things in our forecasts have been. So, well, let's leave our conversation there. Thank you, Cobus, for your time as well. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.